Welcome to the Protestants and Politics Podcast. I'm your host, Nap Nasworth. I've been exploring the intersection of churches, Christians, theology, and public life for over 20 years, as both a professor and a journalist. But I still have lots of questions. I invite you to continue learning with me as I interview interesting voices in this field.
He and his administration is going against, what many believe the Christian scriptures say about welcoming the stranger or the immigrant. None of that matters. What they want is access to political power for their group. And really the us of Christian nationalism is, white, native-born, culturally Christian Americans. And so in that sense, Trump is exactly what they've been searching for and exactly what they want.
What is Christian nationalism? How does it influence voting? My guest to talk about this is Andrew Whitehead. He is Associate Professor of Sociology and Director of ARDA, the Association of Religion Data Archives at the Center for Religion and American Culture at Indiana University. In 2019, Professor Whitehead co-authored an article for Sociology of Religion called Make America Christian Again: Christian Nationalism and Voting for Donald Trump in the 2016 Presidential Election. That article won the Distinguished Article Award for both the Association for the Sociology of Religion and the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion. And that article was turned into a book that was published this year called Taking America Back for God: Christian Nationalism in the United States, with his co-author Samuel Perry, who is Associate Professor of Sociology and Religion at the University of Oklahoma. Professor Whitehead, welcome to the Protestants and Politics Podcast.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
All right. So how do you define Christian nationalism?
The way that we define Christian nationalism is as a cultural framework. And so by that, we mean it's a collection of myths and symbols, traditions, value systems, and even narratives that idealize and advocate for a close fusion and relationship between Christianity and American civic life. But the Christianity in Christian nationalism, we find, is something more than maybe just the historic Christian faith or, being able to identify with some of the orthodox beliefs, but that it comes with a number of other aspects to it and assumptions that, really are about nativism, being from America, white supremacy, patriarchy, and even militarism. And so as a cultural framework, we like to understand it as really a lens through which Americans see and interpret their social worlds, and even then decide how to act within those social worlds, basically creating an identity of this is who we are and this is what we're all about as Americans. Okay,
so it's not just patriotism, right? It's something. Is it distinct from patriotism, you'd say?
Yeah, I think so. A lot of times people will think about patriotism and then nationalism as patriotism is saying, I love my country and the people that are a part of this country. And then nationalism is something more where it's like, I think my country is better than all the other countries, in opposition to it, and that we need to lift this country up and have it be over everyone else. And so I think that with Christian nationalism, it isn't just patriotism, kind of like when the Olympics roll around, every 4 years and we cheer for those people that are from America, but it's about privileging a certain interpretation and type of Christianity, again, almost in quotes, over and above any other religious groups, and even racial, ethnic, or immigrant groups in the United States, privileging access to power and privilege.
All right, and this is also distinct from the concept of a civil religion, right?
Yeah, we think that it is. So civil religion in American history is kind of this idea of this ethical understanding of who we are as people of this nation, and that it has an understanding of kind of a providential figure, God or a being that we need to have civic virtue and to be able to live together. There are parts of this civil religion that will allow us to look out for what's best for others and so that all can flourish. And that has existed for a very long time in the U.S. But Christian nationalism, we think, is actually different, where it has a much more specific view of providence, where it would really be more of the Christian God, and even that Jesus Christ and kind of an evangelical understanding of the Christian God. We have a covenantal relationship with that God, and that we need to make sure we adhere to specific laws and social policies in order to stay on God's good side, so that God will bless us. And if we don't, then the wrath of God will fall on us. And then, too, that God has a plan for the world, and the United States has a special part to play in that. And so it really is more of a kind of an ethnic understanding, just similar to the nation of Israel, where we're God's special plan and a part of that special plan. And so we need to make sure we follow through on those and make sure that we stay on God's good side in that sense.
Okay, so talk now about some of the main findings. So you came up with this scale, and it had some explanatory power with regard to the election and some other things. So talk about some of those.
Yeah, definitely. So when we measure Christian nationalism, we utilize large surveys of the American public, and we ask people 6 different questions. And so these are questions like: do you believe the United States is part of God's plan for the world? Or do you believe the federal government should advocate Christian values or allow the display of religious symbols in public spaces? And then people are able to either strongly disagree or strongly agree, or disagree and agree. So there's a whole kind of a spectrum there where they could agree with or disagree with those questions. And then what we do is we assign each one a point value. And so if you strongly disagree with all of these questions about how much Christianity or religion should be privileged in the public sphere, you would score a 0. So if you strongly disagree on all, you're a 0. And that puts you at one end of the Christian nationalism spectrum. But if you strongly agree with all of those, then you're at the very opposite end. And so when we add all those up, we can see that across the whole spectrum, Americans are pretty evenly distributed. So it isn't as though it's just, are you a Christian nationalist, yes or no? But there are varying degrees of how much people embrace or resist or reject Christian nationalism. And then what we found within that whole spectrum is there are essentially 4 different groups. So we have rejectors. Those are Americans who, as the word says, reject Christian nationalism, do not believe that Christianity should be privileged over and above, non-religion or other religious groups. And then we have resistors, and they are uneasy with a close relationship between Christianity and civic culture. But they're not as comprehensive in their rejection of it. So they're resistant to it. And then we have accommodators. And so those are Americans who believe that Christianity plays a positive role in American civic life in the past and could in the future, but not necessarily to the extent where it should be the only religious expression in the public sphere. And so while they are supportive of Christianity playing a role, it's not comprehensive. And then we have at the other end ambassadors. And so these are the Americans who strongly embrace Christian nationalism and believe that the United States is and should be a Christian nation. It should be privileged in the public sphere. And so with those 4 groups, we're able to look across a whole host of different attitudes, beliefs, behaviors, like you said. And so for like a quick hit here, when we predict the Trump vote in 2016, we find that Christian nationalism, even when we account for religious practice or whether somebody's an evangelical or a mainline Protestant, their religious tradition, or their sociodemographics, or even their political party, we find that Christian nationalism is one of the strongest predictors of voting for Trump. So ambassadors and accommodators are much more likely to vote for Trump. If we look at racial attitudes, like whether people believe that the police treat Black Americans the same as white Americans, we find that Christian nationalism is, again, a very important predictor of racial attitudes and racial injustice in this country. If we look at attitudes towards religious minorities, again, Christian nationalism is an important and significant predictor in, being afraid or fearful of non-Christian religions or even the non-religious, like atheists. And so there's actually many more that we look at throughout the book, but we really find that Christian nationalism is a really strong predictor of how people view power in the world. So the groups that should have power and privilege and those that shouldn't. It creates very strong boundaries around religion and race and nativism. And then it really desires order. So how the family is structured and who's allowed to have kind of power within the family. Christian nationalism is a very strong predictor of that too. So it really is, as a cultural framework, something that's really important to understanding the polarization in our society and then how people vote, to who they marry or who they think should be allowed to marry, to who belongs, both racially and religiously.
So, in some ways, Trump seems kind of like a ridiculous sort of avatar for Christian nationalism because he's like this. He's this rich reality TV show guy who lives in a New York penthouse, and
Yeah,
he doesn't he doesn't
right.
evoke that sort of image. So when you look at him and sort of he'll come out on stage and hug the flag and all that. So what do you see when you watch Trump and sort of his messaging or his appeals that you think, why would he appeal to Christian nationalists?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think in a lot of our work, we really believe that Trump is kind of the perfect test of the power of Christian nationalism. Because in the past, it isn't as though he's the first one that has utilized kind of this Christian nationalist framework of, I'm going to protect Christianity, or the U.S. is a Christian nation, those types of things. Other Republican candidates in the past have used that. But with those candidates, they would have this, they would at least go to some extent trying to show that they are personally religious, that they take it seriously, that they are people of faith or Christians. But Trump really doesn't worry about that at all, right? So it's kind of famous, the different gaffes he's had about the Christian, doctrine or the Christian scriptures. And so, in his personal life, you can tell it's just not important to him at all. But he is very willing to still utilize that rhetoric and say that, it's important. I will protect you. I will protect the Christian heritage in this country. And so we can see that for many of these Americans, ambassadors especially, it isn't about the personal religiosity of the figurehead or the person in power, but whether or not they're going to privilege, again, their view and ideas of what it means to be a Christian nation. And to the extent that this person does that, they're all in. And so this really, I think, gives a good understanding of why Trump is the embodiment of all they've been searching for, because they want a strong man at the helm, making sure that they maintain access to the halls of power, the centers of political power. And as long as he does that, they are just fine. It doesn't matter whether there's, a tape that comes out like before the 2016 election of him bragging about sexual assault, or if in different policies, he and his administration is going against, what many believe the Christian scriptures say about welcoming the stranger or the immigrant. None of that matters. What they want is access to political power for their group. And really the us of Christian nationalism is, white, native born, culturally Christian Americans. And so in that sense, Trump is exactly what they've been searching for and exactly what they want.
The one thing you hear often with regard to Trump supporters is it's white evangelicals. That's his base and so forth. So when you look at Christian nationalism with relation to white evangelicalism, what do you find?
Yeah, that's a great point. And something that we really try to draw out in the book is that, after the 2016 election, even through these last 4 years of the Trump administration, we do hear that a lot in the media, that it's white evangelicals, and they are, overwhelmingly 80%, as we still find in many polls, supportive of Trump. But what we see and what we try to bring to the discussion is that it isn't necessarily white evangelicalism that is the mechanism that binds many of these Americans to Trump, but it really is Christian nationalism. So let me kind of unpack that a little bit. So among white evangelicals, Christian nationalism is pretty overwhelmingly embraced. So the accommodators and ambassadors, many of them are evangelicals, but not all of them, right? So there are many Americans who are not white evangelicals that are also accommodators and ambassadors. And what we find is that those Americans, they might be Catholic, they might be liberal or mainline Protestant. If they are ambassadors of Christian nationalism, they're just as likely to support Donald Trump as white evangelicals who are also ambassadors. And on the flip side of that, when we have white evangelicals who reject Christian nationalism, they are much less likely to vote for Donald Trump than white evangelicals who are ambassadors of Christian nationalism. So what we see is it isn't necessarily white evangelicalism, but it's whether or not these white evangelicals embrace Christian nationalism. Because those that don't, those that reject it, they aren't supportive of Trump in the least. And so I think this gives us a little more precision when we're talking about the Americans that embrace Trump. Cutting across different religious categories is this cultural framework of Christian nationalism. So whether they believe the U.S. is and should be a Christian nation, want to see this heritage, as they would call it, defended, that's what really binds them to Donald Trump, not necessarily their religious tradition in that sense.
Does that work for Black Protestants as well?
That's a great question. And what we find is that it does not. So, Black Protestants, they're actually quite likely to be accommodators of Christian nationalism, and many are ambassadors. But we find that, unlike other white religious traditions, Black Protestants, even if they're ambassadors, are no more likely to vote for Donald Trump than are Black Protestants that are rejectors. And so, even though they embrace this idea of a Christian nation, they do not support Donald Trump. And in many ways, how they view, racial injustice issues, Christian nationalism for white Americans is highly predictive, but for Black Americans, it has no real effect because, again, their experiences in this country and how they view this idea of a Christian nation has more to do with, going after equality and that all should be able to live and, do what they want to do in this country, similar to what we see with Martin Luther King Jr. or William Barber in the present day, or Frederick Douglass. They believed the U.S. was a Christian nation, but in that sense, they believed they should call the U.S. to account on how it treats Africans or African Americans. And so we see that it does work differently within that religious group.
Do Democrats also make appeals to Christian nationalists or say things that would be appealing to Christian nationalists?
It could be, but to a much lesser extent. Generally, Democrats or Democratic politicians are going to utilize, to some extent, more of a civil religion rather than Christian nationalism. Because Christian nationalism is so intertwined with privileging particular racial groups and religious groups, to the extent that Democrats are, working towards or desire to see a more pluralistic society where one group or one particular group is, not privileged above all. Christian nationalism really is about trying to maintain access to power for white, native-born cultural Christians. And so when Democrats are talking about God or using that God talk, it tends to be much more ecumenical and open, which just does not activate the same type of support among Christian nationalists or ambassadors overall. And so I think it is something different that they're speaking to.
Did you measure, did you have any questions showing their support for the xenophobic or nativist policies? So are Christian nationalists more likely to, reject Muslims or Muslim immigrants, or find appeals with the, blocking Muslims from coming here and those sorts of appeals?
Yeah, we sure do. So in the second or the third chapter of our book, we title it Boundaries. And this is one of the main things that we look at is the types of boundaries that Christian nationalism creates around American identity. And it really does revolve around whether you are from here, so this kind of nativist tendency where there's high degrees of anti-immigrant belief, among ambassadors and even accommodators, where if you aren't from here, they're much more suspicious or fearful of you. And they want to take steps to ensure that it is much more difficult for people to come here. So you must be native born. And then intertwined with that is religion, where if you are of a non-Christian or non-religion, they again don't see you as a part of what it means to be American, and who should be allowed to be here or have access to civic culture in the United States. So they're much more fearful or see threat from Muslims or atheists and even Jewish Americans. Christian nationalism and ambassadors of Christian nationalism are more likely to believe that Jewish Americans are a threat to them, both physically and then to their morals and values in this country. And so we see really strict and tight boundaries around whether you are from here and fear of immigrants, but also religion. You must be in some sense culturally Christian in their view to really be able to say that you are American and to access all this country has to offer.
Now, I know you look at both big data and you sort of follow these debates within the culture as well. And so there has been, or there are Christian leaders, white evangelical leaders as well, who flat out reject Christian nationalism on theological grounds, right?
Right.
So does that show up in the data?
Yeah, it sure does. So what we find is that, I mentioned earlier with, across different religious groups, once we take into account, somebody's level of Christian nationalism, it really doesn't matter whether they're an evangelical Protestant or, of no affiliation at all. It really is the Christian nationalism that is doing the heavy lifting on explaining, how they vote or what they believe. And then we also find that religious attendance and religious practice works differently than Christian nationalism. So over and over again, for some of the things that we look at in the book, we see that once we account for somebody's level of Christian nationalism, whether they go to church more or pray more or read their sacred scriptures more, they're more likely to be welcoming to the immigrants or less likely to be fearful of different religious groups. They're less likely to want to make sure that people give proper respect to America, or bowing, or they don't want them kneeling for the flag, all of those things. And so what we find is that it again really isn't just religion that's doing this, but it's the degree to which they embrace Christian nationalism. So for these leaders that reject or Americans that reject Christian nationalism, many of them are religious. They attend a lot, they read their Bible a lot, they may even affiliate with evangelical Protestant traditions. But again, it's not being a part of those traditions or being religious, but whether or not they embrace Christian nationalism or reject it. And so again, that cultural framework really helps us understand the role of religion in explaining many of these attitudes, or again, how polarized we are on a number of these issues in the present day.
Since Trump has brought more attention to this, I mean, I assume you're going to keep looking at these questions over time. Do you think there'll be greater resistance? I know it seems like there's been more people speaking out against it during the Trump administration. So
Yeah.
what do you expect to see as far as change over time?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in our book, we were able to compare levels of Christian nationalism over time. So from 2007 to 2017, and then using a different data set, looking from 1996 to 2014. And we have a couple of interesting findings. One is that the degree to which Americans believe, Christianity should be privileged, or it's really important to American identity, does respond to different historical moments. So soon after 9/11, we see kind of a spike in this idea of Christian nationalism. Because again, with that, we were really, as a country, we're defining ourselves against what we saw as, these terrorists, and that to be American, this idea of being Christian was kind of heightened. But then that actually tapered off by 2014. But then we also find from 2007 to 2017 that there is some shift in how many people are ambassadors. So there's actually a small decline. Accommodators kind of stayed the same. Rejectors and resistors actually grew a little bit larger, a couple percentage points. But there were actually significant differences. So it wasn't just by chance, but these groups were shifting in size. And so it raises a couple of important questions, thinking about, is this demographic change happening? So we see that ambassadors are generally older. So as they, die, they're not necessarily being replaced by younger ambassadors. And so we're going to keep tracking it, but it'll be important to see whether or not this is something where, as people get older, do they start to embrace Christian nationalism more? Or, those that embrace Christian nationalism, are they, is that group going to continue to shrink as they get older and die? So it's something important to track, because I think, with the last 4 years, Donald Trump and the administration, his supporters, have really leaned into this. And so there's going to be some, and we even see data now where there are some young people that have been turned off by this and are rejecting this idea of the U.S. as a Christian nation. But will we be able to see that? Is it large enough where it'll show up across the whole population or not? Remains to be seen. But it's a really important question, and will be really interesting to try and figure out as we go on.
Yeah, and it seems like you're saying as well that this could help explain the difference between so-called never Trump evangelicals and Trump supporting evangelicals.
Yeah, I think Christian nationalism is really the main explanatory mechanism of these evangelicals. Some that completely reject Trump, and others that are strongly embracing him. It really comes down to whether they think that the U.S. in their view is a Christian nation and should be privileged. This idea of a white Christian culture. I think that really does explain how and why some reject that and others don't.
What do we still not know? Like, what are some questions that you still have that you want more data from, that you still feel like you need to better understand or want to better understand about Christian nationalism?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things. One that I'm interested in is, how this cultural framework can be activated for some people, or are there ways that we can, one way to put it, deactivate it? So in what situations or topics or whatever are people more likely to draw upon this cultural framework, and in others they're not? Or is it so pervasive that no matter what, if people are thinking about or seeing themselves as a part of this group, that it's going to play a role in how they view a situation? And so I think gathering data will be important for this too, because we get asked a lot, well, how do we turn this back? Or are there ways to kind of, work against this Christian nationalism that makes us, so xenophobic, or, encourages kind of racist views and all this stuff? And so knowing exactly how it operates, within people or as they look at different situations, I think is important. And then the other thing that we're really starting to do now, and we want to continue doing, is thinking about how this cultural framework operates within different racial groups. Because as you pointed out, and I mentioned earlier, for Black Protestants, when we're talking about immigration or other religious groups, or voting for Trump, Christian nationalism does not incline them and work in that group the same as it does for white Americans. And so we really want to try and figure out exactly why that is, and thinking about how Christian nationalism really is racialized. So whether it's in a white group, or for Black Americans, or other racial groups, trying to really figure out how it works and why, I think is really important to understanding the power of this cultural framework and the ways that it really influences beliefs across these different groups in America.
Okay. And so what are your future research plans? So we should have some big data coming out with the election, right? Are you going to be examining that with relation to Christian nationalism?
Yeah, definitely. So we should be able to gather some data, hopefully after the election or soon after the election, and hopefully too, with our work, other polls will start to take this into account, that we can't just see what religious tradition somebody's a part of, but we have to think about, whether they think Christianity or religion should be privileged in the public sphere, like Christian nationalism. So we hope to do that. And I think some other issues are, the ongoing pandemic. My colleague Sam Perry has been collecting some really great data on what people are doing or how they view the pandemic. And then two, the ongoing racial unrest in the United States with, the most recent example, Breonna Taylor, and refusing to charge any of the policemen with her murder, or whether, it's the other things throughout this past summer. Continuing to see and realize, how Christian nationalism is intertwined with, white supremacy and racial superiority. I think those are really important things that we want to continue to do in the future, even beyond the 2020 election.
Yeah, I look forward to seeing what else you can find. All right, Andrew Whitehead, thank you for joining the Protestants and Politics podcast.
You're very welcome. Thanks a lot for having me.
This episode was recorded on September 25th of 2020. Be sure to sign up for the Protestants and Politics newsletter. I'll include a link to it in the podcast description. Thanks for listening.